What happens when a Hollywood icon walks into a morning show, expecting to share his life's most meaningful work only, to be blindsided, humiliated, and forced to defend his legacy live on national television? This isn't your usual celebrity interview. This is what happens when Danny DeVito, beloved by millions for his decades of unforgettable characters, finds himself under fire, not for what he's done, but for who someone thinks he is. And it all unfolds in real time, under the unforgiving glow of studio lights, as the cameras keep rolling. So before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below, because what you're about to witness is unlike anything you've ever seen on daytime TV. It started like any other Tuesday at the Good Morning America studios. Danny DeVito arrived early, cradling a tall coffee cup, his demeanor warm and familiar to everyone around. He cracked jokes with the makeup crew, chatted with producers, and adjusted the lapels of his tailored jacket with the relaxed ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He was 78, now still sharp, still funny, still unmistakably Danny. But this time, he wasn't here to promote a comedy or reminisce about his career. He was here for something deeply personal, an environmental documentary he'd poured 3 years of his life into, a film he'd self-financed, co-directed, and narrated, traveling to some of the most remote and devastated parts of the globe to expose the brutal consequences of climate change. He wasn't just proud, he was invested, and he'd chosen good. Morning America, deliberately, he trusted George Stephanopoulos. He thought George would give him space to talk seriously about the science, the people, the stakes. But what Danny didn't know was that George had spent the night before combing through old gossip columns, stand-up routines from the 80s, and Reddit threads. He hadn't watched the documentary. He wasn't interested in the science. He was looking for a hit. The audience applauded as Danny walked onto the bright stage. He gave a quick wave, a familiar smile, and settled into the chair across from George, completely unaware that the man sitting opposite him had a very different agenda. Danny DeVito. "Everyone," George said, the applause still echoing as the studio lights warmed up. "Thank you for being here." "Thanks for having me, George. Really looking forward to diving into this documentary. It's something I'm incredibly proud of." George gave a nod, but there was a glint in his eye that Danny missed. A flicker of something calculated. "We'll definitely get to that," George said smoothly. "But first, I think our viewers would be interested in a few other things." Danny blinked. Other things. George shuffled his papers with a kind of performative flair. "Of course, before we dive into your environmental work, I think it's important we talk about the bigger picture, who you really are, how your career reflects your values." The air shifted. Danny straightened slightly in his chair, confused. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." "Well," George continued, "you've built a long career, playing morally, let's say challenging characters. Frank Reynolds, the Penguin, those roles are iconic, but not exactly aspirational." Danny offered a polite chuckle. "George, I'm an actor. That's what we do. I play characters. Nobody thinks Anthony Hopkins actually eats people." George wasn't laughing. His tone tightened. "But when those roles span decades, when your characters consistently glorify dysfunction, indulgence, and manipulation, at what point do we ask if that's just entertainment or something deeper, something reflective?" Danny. "Prose came here to talk about climate change," he said quietly. "Yes," George said, "but let's talk about that too, because some might say it's a little contradictory, don't you think? A man whose career was built on excess, on glorifying waste and chaos, now rebranding himself as a defender of the earth." Danny's hands gripped the arms of the chair. "Are you serious?" George pressed on, his voice like a scalpel. "Let's go through your filmography, shall we? Batman Returns. You're literally trying to drown children. It's Always Sunny. You promote fraud, violence, substance abuse. You've made a fortune off of playing chaos, and now you want the public to see you as an environmental crusader." The audience was silent now. A few camera operators exchanged worried glances. Something was off, very off. Danny inhaled sharply. "George, I think you're confusing the actor with the act. That's dangerous. I didn't come here to be psychoanalyzed. I came here to share a project that highlights real suffering, real science. But when someone uses their fame to push a political message," George said, his voice growing harder, "we have to ask about sincerity, authenticity." "Why now, Danny? Why suddenly this shift? Danny stared. His voice, when it came, was low, razor-thin. You invited me here to talk about the documentary, and instead you're implying I'm a fraud. I'm simply asking the questions people want answered. Danny let out a dry, bitter laugh. No, you're trying to score points. You want viral moments, not meaningful dialogue. Danny, George said, his tone suddenly paternal. Don't overreact. That was the wrong word. Danny's face twisted, just slightly. Overreact? Yes, George said. I'm doing my job. We're having a mature conversation about public accountability. You want mature? Danny's voice cracked, fury bubbling beneath his calm. Should have watched the documentary. You should have seen the footage from Tuvalu where the ocean is swallowing homes. You should have talked to the scientists. We interviewed people dedicating their lives to solving a crisis you clearly don't understand. George waved a hand, almost dismissively. But do the people trust you, Danny? Given your history, the bar fights, the rumors, the difficult behavior on set, shouldn't we be asking whether you are the right messenger? Danny leaned forward now, his entire body coiled like a spring. Bar fights, that's what you bring up. You're quoting gossip from 30 years ago to discredit science. It's about trust, Danny. No, it's about distraction. About poisoning the well before anyone can even drink from it. The audience was visibly uncomfortable. Some were whispering. One woman in the front row looked like she wanted to stand up and walk out. George smirked. Look, I understand this is important to you, but when someone like you, an actor, not a scientist, tries to shift the narrative, people are right to question it. Danny's voice dropped to a whisper. Do you know what it cost me to make this? Time, money, health. I spent 18 months in the Arctic. I filmed melting glaciers. I sat with farmers in India who lost everything. I worked with MIT researchers, with Oxford scientists, but you didn't watch it, did you? George said nothing. Of course not, Danny continued, because facts don't trend, sound bites do. You're being emotional, George said. You're being lazy, Danny snapped. This isn't journalism, it's theater, and you're not a reporter, you're a ringmaster hoping someone cracks on air so you can milk the fallout. George shuffled his notes, trying to recover. Our viewers deserve transparency. Danny stood up. The room shifted. Transparency. You want transparency? He turned to face the cameras, arms wide. Here it is, folks. I came here today thinking I'd be allowed to share something I've worked my heart out for. Instead, I got blindsided by a man so obsessed with controversy, he didn't bother to ask a single real question. George held up a hand. Please, Danny, if you could, I'm done. Danny's voice cracked through the silence. I've been on television sets for 4 decades. I've dealt with egos, with studio heads, with critics, but I've never been treated with this level of disrespect masked as professionalism. Danny, George said again, this is a national broadcast. Please. Danny walked to the edge of the stage, turned back to the audience. If you care about what's happening to this planet, watch the film. Learn something. Don't let people like this decide what's important. Don't let noise drown out truth. And with that, he unclipped his mic, set it on the chair, and walked off set. The audience was frozen. Someone began to clap 1, 2, then a wave. George sat stiffly in his chair, face pale. Notes scattered. The broadcast didn't cut. The cameras kept rolling. The silence that fell across the Good Morning America set wasn't the kind that begged to be broken. It was the kind that dared anyone to try. And for a few agonizing seconds, no one did. Cameras kept rolling, the studio lights burned hot, and every crew member stood frozen, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of making things worse. Danny DeVito stared at George Stephanopoulos like he was trying to make sense of what just happened, as if he had walked onto a different set in a parallel universe where kindness had been replaced with cruelty. His breathing was slow, deliberate, like a man trying to keep the ground from swallowing him whole. But the eyes that gleamed that had once brought laughter to millions now flickered with disbelief, hurt, and an unmistakable edge of fury. George, for a moment, looked almost embarrassed, but just as quickly he adjusted his posture, straightened, the cue cards in his hand, and tried to press forward. We're live, Danny, he said with a forced chuckle. You know how this works? Danny didn't blink. Yeah, George, I do know how it works. I thought I did. Anyway, come on, you're Show, promote the work, maybe share a laugh. I didn't come here to be baited into a gotcha segment like I'm on trial. The control room was in chaos. Producers whispered furiously into headsets. "Do we cut?" one voice hissed. "No, this is ratings gold," another snapped back. Meanwhile, the viewership numbers online were spiking. Hashtags were already trending. Hashtag Danny V's George, hashtag Morning Mel, hashtag Respect DeVito. Trying to regain control, George turned to the camera with the polished ease of a man trained to navigate public disasters. "We appreciate Mr. DeVito's candor and his passion. Let's pivot now to talk about his documentary," but Danny wasn't having it. "No," he cut in sharply, "no pivot. Not until I say this." The studio air seemed to contract, as if every molecule had frozen in anticipation. "I've been in this industry for over 5 decades, Danny said, voice steady but sharp. "I've played every kind of fool on screen so audiences could laugh. I've sat on countless couches like this one, sold movies, TV shows, even jokes I didn't believe in. But today, this is the first time I've been treated like my years of work mean nothing. Like I'm some washed-up clown you can drag in front of a camera and strip down for sport." George's expression tightened. "Danny, with all due respect," Danny snapped, his voice rising now, "you spent 10 minutes tearing apart a project I poured my soul into without even watching it. You tried to smear me with out-of-context quotes. You tried to turn my passion into a punchline. So don't insult me with that line." The audience, both in studio and online, erupted. Some clapped, some gasped. Others simply stared at a television moment that felt like it was veering off script and into something raw and real. A young production assistant brought out water. Danny waved it away. George, ever the anchor, leaned in, trying to wrest control. "We were simply holding you accountable for—" "No," Danny interrupted again. "You were setting me up. There's a difference." Another beat passed. This time, it was George who looked visibly shaken, but the lines there no longer mattered. There was no script left that could save this segment. Finally, Danny leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping into something softer, but no less intense. "I came here to talk about the people in my film. Real people. Kids in Louisiana dealing with floodwaters in their living rooms. Farmers in Arizona who can't grow crops anymore. Islanders losing their homes to rising seas. I didn't come here to defend my character to a man who hasn't looked me in the eye once since this interview started." It hit George like a blow. The room didn't react, but the impact was visible on his face. "I've made mistakes in my life," Danny continued, "but this documentary isn't one of them, and I won't let your ego reduce it to a tabloid headline." There was nothing left to say. Not for George, not for the producers in the control room, not for anyone. And yet, the show had to go on. The director gave the signal, and the camera slowly panned back as the segment wrapped. George managed a stiff smile and read the outro from the monitor. "Well, thank you to Mr. Danny DeVito for joining us. Before It's Gone premieres this Friday. Check your local listings." As soon as the cameras cut, Danny stood up, adjusted his jacket, and without a word, walked off the set. The audience stood and applauded, not politely, but thunderously. Some whistled, others called his name, and for a man who had just endured a public ambush, he walked out with the pride of someone who had just won a battle that mattered. Outside the studio, reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in his face. "Danny, will you ever go back on GM? Do you regret speaking out?" "Not one." And with that, he stepped into the black SUV waiting at the curb and disappeared down the Manhattan streets, leaving behind a newsroom in stunned silence and a country glued to its screens. Watching the fallout unfold by the afternoon, the clips had gone viral. Late-night hosts scrambled to rewrite their monologues. But beneath the noise, something deeper had taken root in overdue conversation about the media, celebrity, dignity, and the cost of using real lives as spectacle. Danny DeVito didn't just survive the ambush, he turned it into a reckoning. And maybe, just maybe, a reminder that even in a world built on make-believe, some moments are unforgettably, painfully real. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because if you thought this was explosive, wait till you see what happens next. Stay tuned.